Hey guys, it's Libby, and this is going to be the first video in a new series that I'm doing about classical literature. Now I'm calling it a guide to ancient literature because the word classics is slightly confusing. So right now, in this 21st century that we are in, classics, when you talk about classic literature, you mean like kind of anything before 1900 and also probably a couple things after 1900. But the word originally meant Greek and Roman stuff. So for these contexts, when I use the word classics, it means Greek and Roman literature. I have a degree in ancient Greek, and I also took Latin for 4 semesters. I read at least all of the highlights of the classical canon, at least in English, and then some of them I've read in the original language. So since there is a lot of this, we're going to break it down by genre, starting with what's probably the oldest genre, epic poetry. Epic poetry got started as an oral tradition probably in the 8th, maybe the 9th century BCE, and then it was written down a couple of centuries later. That's in Greece, and the 2 complete epic poems that everyone talks about from Greece are the Iliad and the Odyssey. You'll probably see these listed as being written by Homer. That's maybe not the truest thing that has ever been said. Homer was probably a person who actually existed and was a poet. Who was part of the oral tradition, not the written tradition, so he didn't actually write these down. And there were, of course, lots of other people reciting these poems as well. So the Iliad and the Odyssey are really a group effort. And then there's 2 epic poems from the Romans that I'm going to talk about. The first one is the Aeneid by Virgil, and the second one is the Metamorphoses by Ovid. These were both definitely written by their authors. They were sort of taking some cues from the Greeks, but the history of these texts is different than the history of the Greek texts. What I want to do with this series is help you find a good place to start with classical literature for you, and also give you some tips for how to read and how to approach the concepts. Now, the first piece of advice I'm going to give you is bad news. I'm going to tell you that it's really going to help if you buy a translation. I know that a lot of translations of these are in the public domain, so you can get them for free online. However, stuff, at least in the United States, that's in the public domain is from before 1923. So you're going to be reading older translations with older type of writing, Victorian style writing, and not only Victorian style writing, but they were sort of trying to make the translations sound old. So most translations are not very accessible. You're going to want a translation from at least after 1950. And for the epic poems, Robert Fagle's has some good ones. So starting with the Iliad. This is set during the Trojan War, which is a at least moderately mythical war. It's not really clear how much of it is based in reality. It could just be that there was a big fight and then characters got attached to it later. It's possible that some of these characters are based on real people. Who knows? But the Trojan War was fought between an alliance of the Greeks and the Trojans, who were living in what is now Turkey. They may have been ethnically Greek or they may have been ethnically Hittite. Now, a common misconception about the Iliad is that it is about the whole Trojan War. It's not. It's about maybe 2 or 3 weeks towards the end of the Trojan War. So the abduction of Helen, which instigates the war, is not part of it. There's 10 years of fighting, which is not part of the Iliad. The sack of Troy with the Trojan horse, that's not part of the Iliad. The Iliad is basically just about this fight between Achilles and Agamemnon, who were 2 of the Greek generals, and how it kind of gets out of hand. What's going on is the Greeks have formed an alliance between various city-states to get back Helen of Troy, who is the wife of another Greek king who was abducted by the Trojan prince Paris. And Agamemnon is in charge because he is the rich older brother of Helen's husband. So he's technically in charge, but a lot of the other sort of leaders from their regions chafe under his dictates. So what's happened at the beginning is that Agamemnon and Achilles, who is the leader of the Myrmidons, have received war prizes, which are sex slaves, women who've been abducted from neighboring towns. And Agamemnon's war prize is the daughter of a priest of Apollo who asks Apollo to rain down arrows of fire and plague on the Greeks until he gets his daughter back. So Agamemnon has to give up his war prize, and then he's like, well, I'm just gonna take Achilles then, because I'm in charge. And Achilles is like, oh no you don't. And he refuses to fight. And because their leader isn't fighting in the war, the rest of the Myrmidons aren't fighting in the war until his friend Patroclus decides that Achilles is being selfish and they need to help with the war effort, and he leads the Myrmidons into battle. The rest, you probably know what happens, but in case you don't, I'm not going to spoil it for you. Now, the way I would suggest reading this book is to skim it. There's a lot of parts that are boring. There's a lot of parts that don't have anything to do with the plot. So what I would do is make a list of the important characters, and when you're reading, just skim through until you get to something with the main characters in it and read those parts. That's going to be most of the book, but it will allow you to skip things like all of book 2, which is just a list about like all of the different people who have come and how many boats they brought and how many men they brought and what their homeland looks like and who their father was, and it just... nobody likes book 2. So if you have any familiarity with the Trojan War, you'll know who the key players are. For the Greeks, it's Agamemnon, Menelaus, Achilles, Patroclus, Ajax, and Odysseus. For the Trojans, it's Hector, Paris, Helen, Priam, Hecuba, Cassandra, Andromache, and Aeneas. And then also the Olympian gods like Athena, Zeus, Aphrodite, and Ares. There are 3 characters who don't have really good press in modern adaptations of the Trojan War story, but who are important in the Iliad, so you should read about them too. One of them is Sarpedon, who is an ally of the Trojans. Another is Diomedes, who's one of the Greek soldiers. And finally, Thetis, who is Achilles' mother, who is also a goddess. So if you're reading a page and your eyes are starting to cross and you're getting bored and you notice that none of their names are on the page, just skip to the next page. The other Greek epic poem is the Odyssey. You've probably heard of this. This is about Odysseus, one of the Greek generals, his trip home after the Trojan War. Odysseus is most famous for coming up with the idea of the Trojan horse to get the Greeks inside the walls of Troy. But that is like vaguely mentioned in the Odyssey. The Odyssey is not really about the sack of Troy either. So Odysseus has managed to offend the god Poseidon, and Poseidon is the god of the seas, and Odysseus needs to get home on the seas. So it takes him 10 years to get home. The first 4 books, and book sort of means chapter, aren't actually about Odysseus. They're about Telemachus, his son, who decides that he needs to go out and look for his father. I think that these are interesting enough in their own right, but if you decide you really don't care, you can skip ahead to book 5. Most people recommend the Odyssey over the Iliad. You certainly don't have to have read the Iliad before you've read the Odyssey. It does hit on a lot more relevant cultural knowledge if you want to just sort of read the classics to get a literary education. You know, it's helpful to know about things like the Sirens and Scylla and Charybdis and Circe turning the men into pigs. And the Odyssey translates pretty well into English. It sort of maintains its quality from Greek to English. But I do think that the Iliad is a better book. So like if this is the Odyssey and this is the Greek and this is the English, the Iliad is better in Greek but worse in English. My one tip for reading this book is make sure that you keep all of the people whose name starts with the syllables E-U-R-Y straight. There's 3 different characters whose names all start with that. Eurynome, Eurymachus, and another one that I don't even remember. Now moving over to the Romans. Greek literature is really popular. It's considered to be a high art. And Virgil, who's sort of the court poet to the Emperor Augustus, decides to write his own epic poem. And since his patron is the emperor, it's a fairly propagandistic poem. The Aeneid is about Aeneas, who was one of the leaders of the Trojan military, and he's pretty much the only important person to survive the Trojan War. He escapes while the city is being sacked with a couple of other Trojans. And after some adventures around the Mediterranean, which you gotta have, he ends up in Latium, which is the sort of state where Rome ended up being, and he founds the Roman race. Now, this is different than the story of Romulus and Remus, which you've probably heard of, who are the two twins who are raised by a she-wolf. They want to found the city of Rome. So that's a while after Aeneas has come. And this is a really important nationalist work because Aeneas is the son of the goddess Aphrodite, or Venus in the Roman pantheon. And so because the blood of Aphrodite runs through his veins, the blood of Aphrodite, divine blood, runs through the veins of the Roman people. Also, Aeneas comes and he gets married to a princess of Latium. So this ensures that their heirs are connected to the land. They're not an invading force. It's just all about how the Romans are like super great and totally deserve to live here, and also maybe deserve to live in other people's countries. The Iliad is an unusual poem. It's 12 books or chapters long. The first 6 chapters are about Aeneas escaping from Troy and then wandering around, having crazy things happen to him on the Mediterranean. So in that way, it's reminiscent of the Odyssey. And then the last 6 books are about Aeneas landing in Latium and basically killed a guy who was supposed to marry the princess so that he can marry her instead. So in that way, it's more like the Iliad. The first 6 books I quite like, especially book 2, where we finally get the Trojan horse and the sack of Troy. It only took us 800 years from the beginning of epic poetry to get to something about the Trojan horse, but you know, we got there. And then we spend a couple of books in Carthage, and we learn about Aeneas' relationship with the Queen of Carthage named Dido. You've probably heard of her. Then Aeneas descends into the underworld, which establishes him as a sort of mythic hero. A lot of heroes in Greek myth descend into the underworld. Heroes like Hercules, I think Theseus. Basically, if you want to prove that you're cool, you go down, you talk to Hades, you do something, and then you come back up and be fine. And this is all pretty interesting and pretty readable. And then, about face, it becomes totally boring and awful, in my humble opinion, for the last 6 books. And the end is very controversial. A lot of people think that Virgil didn't actually finish writing the Aeneid. He did die either while he was working on it or shortly after he finished working on it, depending on how you want to count it. And some people think that the ending is just way too abrupt and there was supposed to be something else that we never got. And some people think that the ending is great and exactly as it should be. I don't care. I don't like it either way. And the second half is also not as culturally important. You need to know about the sack of Troy. You need to know about Dido. And that's pretty much all you need that's going to be like referenced in later literature. So what I would do is read the first 4 books in their entirety. Then when you get to books 5 and 6, which is where Aeneas goes down into the underworld, that was interesting to me because there's a lot of sort of references to Roman history. So if you're already a classics nerd, read the underworld section. And then once he gets out of the underworld and they're fighting in Italy, feel free to give up or start skimming whenever you decide you're done. And then the last one is the Metamorphoses. And yes, that is how you pronounce it. Metamorphoses is a book by Franz Kafka about a man turning into a bug. Metamorphoses is a poem by Ovid about Greek and Roman mythology. Now, Ovid was kind of the James Joyce of his time. He was writing a little bit after Virgil, and he was just like nuts. He decided, all these epic poems we've got, they're just not epic enough. They're about one hero doing some things. I'm going to write an epic poem about everything, the history of the world. And so while you can see a lot of similarities between the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, Metamorphoses feels a bit different. It's also, I think, a good place to start with classic literature because it's the first source we have for a lot of the popular classical myths. So it starts with the creation of the world, of course, and it does sort of retread some of the stuff that's been covered in other epic poems. You see some more Odysseus, you see some more Aeneas, but it also covers myths like Apollo and Daphne, Perseus, Orpheus and Eurydice, Pygmalion, right down to Julius Caesar. And Ovid did not originally write them sort of each story individually. There is often a couple of lines connecting one story into the next, but you can kind of read these all separately. What really ties them all together is that sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively, one of the characters in every story changes shape. This is why it's called the Metamorphoses, the shape changings. So what I would do is find a translation that has headings where they've just intruded into the text, you know, this is about the Lapids and the Centaurs, and then flip through and read the ones that interest you. It's not really a problem if you skip things or read things out of order, just do whatever you want. Choose your own metamorphic adventure. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again soon with a video on tragedy.